There is no pain deeper than a father losing his child. When the strongest man alive is brought to his knees by grief, you know something extraordinary is about to happen. In the fjords of ancient Norway, Haldor the Ironbreaker was the most feared Viking warrior in all the lands. His battle axe had claimed more lives than the winter storms, and his name alone could silence a longhouse full of warriors. But now he kneels before Astrid, a healer the village has shunned for her strange visions. Tears flow down his weathered face as he begs her to follow him into the cursed Darkwood forest. His son, Eric, believed dead in battle 3 summers past, calls to him in dreams from a place where even the gods fear to tread. What could drive the mightiest warrior to such desperate vulnerability? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants, wrapping the village of Ravenshollow in a shroud of grey that seemed to mirror the hearts of its people. It was the kind of September morning that whispered of winter's approach, when the fishing boats returned heavy with the day's catch, and the women gathered driftwood for fires that would burn long into the darkening nights. But on this particular morning, something was different. The very air seemed charged with an energy that made the village dogs restless and sent the ravens circling overhead in agitated spirals. Haldor Eriksson stood at the edge of the wooden pier, his massive frame silhouetted against the pale dawn sky. At 43 winters, he remained a formidable sight, broad shoulders that had carried the weight of countless battles, hands scarred from years of wielding his legendary battle axe, and eyes the color of storm clouds that had seen too much death and too little peace. The silver threads in his dark beard spoke of wisdom earned through suffering, while the deep lines around his eyes told stories of both laughter shared with his beloved son and tears shed in the 3 years since Eric's death. The villagers gave him a wide berth as they went about their morning tasks, not from fear, though his reputation commanded respect, but from the kind of reverence reserved for those who carry grief like a sacred burden. They had watched him transform from the jovial giant who would toss children into the air and tell stories around the fire, to this quiet sentinel who stood vigil at the water's edge each morning, as if waiting for a ship that would never return. His weathered hands clutched a small silver pendant, a wolf's head carved with intricate knotwork that had belonged to Eric. The boy had worn it into his final battle, and it had been returned to Haldor, along with news of his son's heroic death, defending a monastery from raiders. The pendant had never left Haldor's person since that black day, and now it seemed to pulse with a warmth that defied the cool morning air. The sound of bare feet on wet stones drew his attention. Astrid Thorsdottir approached with the careful grace of someone long accustomed to moving through a world that wished her invisible. At 35, she possessed the kind of beauty that made men uncomfortable, not because it was overwhelming, but because it was paired with eyes that seemed to see too much. Her auburn hair, streaked with premature silver, fell in a single braid down her back, and her simple brown dress was adorned only with small pouches containing her healing herbs and the runestones that had belonged to her grandmother. The village had once welcomed her gifts. Born to a family of minor nobility, Astrid had shown early promise as a healer, her hands seeming to draw pain from wounds and her knowledge of herbs surpassing even the eldest wise women. But then the visions began, glimpses of tragedies yet to come, whispered. Warnings from the spirit realm that proved all too accurate. When she foresaw the fishing disaster that claimed 7 lives and later predicted the harsh winter that killed the cattle, the gratitude turned to suspicion. Healers were meant to mend what was broken, not speak of breakings yet to come. Now she lived on the outskirts of Ravenshollow, in a small cottage surrounded by a garden of medicinal plants that seemed to thrive despite the poor soil. The villagers still came to her when their children fevered or when women struggled in childbirth, but they came quietly, under cover of darkness, as if her gifts were something shameful to be hidden from the light of day. "The dreams are stronger now," she said without preamble, coming to stand beside Haldor at the pier's edge. Her voice carried the musical quality of someone who had spent years speaking to spirits and the dying, gentle yet clear enough to cut through the morning mist. Haldor's massive hands tightened around the wolf, repentant. In the 3 years since Eric's death, he had shared his dreams with no one. Not even Bjorn Ironside, his closest friend, and the man who had stood beside him in more battles than either could count. But somehow, Astrid knew. She had always known things she shouldn't, had always seen beyond the veil that separated the living from the dead. "He calls to me every night now," Haldor admitted, his voice rough with emotion held too long in check. "Not from Valhalla, as I first believed, but from somewhere else. Somewhere dark and cold and—" He paused, struggling to find words for what defied description. "Somewhere that feels wrong." Astrid nodded, her grey-green eyes fixed on the distant mountains where the darkwood forest began its ancient sprawl across the landscape. "I have seen him in my visions. He stands at the edge of a great clearing, calling not just for you, but for something more. He guards something there, something important." The admission hung between them like morning fog, heavy with implications neither fully understood. Haldor had built his reputation on certainty, the sure swing of his axe, the unwavering loyalty to his men, the absolute knowledge that strength could overcome any obstacle. But this mystery that pulled at his heart like a fishhook, required a different kind of courage entirely. "The elders say the dark wood is cursed," Haldor said, though his tone suggested he had already dismissed their warnings. "They claim it's been forbidden since before their grandfather's time, that no one who enters ever returns unchanged." "The elders speak truth about many things," Astrid replied carefully. "The forest holds ancient power, old grievances that have taken root in the very soil. But they fear what they don't understand, just as they fear me." She turned to face him fully, and Haldor was struck by the determination in her features. "Your son would not call to you without reason, Haldor Eriksson. If he remains in that place, it is because he has chosen to remain." The words hit Haldor like a physical blow. Eric had always been different from the other boys his age, more thoughtful, more sensitive to the moods and feelings of others. While the village children played at being warriors, Eric preferred to sit with the old storytellers, learning the ancient tales and asking questions that made even the wisest elders pause to consider their answers. Haldor had worried that his son's gentle nature would make him weak, had pushed him perhaps too hard toward the warrior's path that seemed the only way to earn respect in their harsh world. "I failed him in life," Haldor said, the words torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "I tried to make him into something he was not, pushed him toward glory he never wanted. If he calls to me now, if he is trapped in that cursed place, then I must answer. I must try to bring him home." Astrid's hand touched his arm briefly, a gesture of comfort from someone who had grown unaccustomed to offering such gestures. "Perhaps," she said softly, "bringing him home is not what he needs. Perhaps what he needs is for his father to finally see him as he truly is." The sun had climbed higher now, burning away the mist and revealing the full bustle of village life. Fishermen mended nets, while their wives prepared the day's catch for smoking. Children ran between the houses, their laughter mixing with the calls of seabirds and the rhythmic sound of hammers on metal from the smithy. It was the eternal rhythm of life in Ravenshollow, unchanged for generations, a comfort to those who found solace in tradition and routine. But Haldor felt that rhythm slipping away from him, replaced by a pull stronger than the tide, his son's voice, calling from beyond the edge of the known world, drawing him toward a destiny he could neither understand nor resist. "Will you come with me?" he asked, turning to face Astrid fully. The request felt strange on his lips. Haldor, the ironbreaker, who had never needed anyone's help in battle, asking for guidance from a woman the village barely tolerated. "Will you help me find my son?" Astrid was quiet for a long moment, her eyes distant, as if seeing things beyond the physical world around them. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of prophecy. The path you wish to walk leads through shadow and sorrow, through truths that will challenge everything you believe about strength and weakness, about life and death. Are you prepared for such a journey? I have been preparing for it every night for 3 years, Haldor replied without hesitation. Every dream, every moment I've stood here waiting for him to come home. I would face all the gods themselves if it meant seeing Eric again. Then yes, Astrid said simply, I will come with you into the Darkwood. But understand this, we may not return as the same people who enter. The forest changes all who walk its paths. As if, in response to her words, the wolf pendant in Haldor's hands grew warm against his palm, and for just a moment he could swear he heard his son's voice, carried on the morning breeze, not calling for rescue, but calling him home to a truth he had been too blind to see. The die was cast. The greatest journey of Haldor's life would begin not with the clash of weapons or the roar of battle, but with a father's love and a healer's wisdom walking together into the unknown. Behind them, Ravenshollow continued its ancient rhythms, unaware that 2 of its people were about to step beyond the bounds of the ordinary world and into a realm where the past and present converged, where ancient wounds waited to be healed, and where the price of redemption might be higher than either could imagine. The news of their intended journey spread through Ravenshollow like wildfire through dry thatch. By midday, a crowd had gathered in the village square, their faces etched with concern and disbelief. At the center of the commotion stood the 3 village elders, Gunnar the Wise, whose white beard reached nearly to his knees, Ingrid Stormcrow, whose sharp eyes had seen 8 decades of seasons, and Thorvald the law speaker, whose word carried the weight of ancient tradition. You speak madness, Haldor Eriksson, Gunnar declared, his voice carrying across the square with the authority of one who had guided the village through countless crises. The Darkwood has been forbidden since the time of our grandfathers' grandfathers. No good can come of disturbing what lies sleeping there. Haldor stood before them, no longer the broken man who had haunted the pier each morning, but the warrior leader his people remembered from better days. Yet there was something different about him now, a quiet determination that spoke of a man who had finally found his purpose after years of drifting in grief's undertow. My son calls to me from that place, he said simply. What father among you would not answer such a call? Bjorn Ironside pushed through the crowd, his weathered face creased with worry. The 2 men had been friends since childhood, had stood shield to shield in more battles than either could count, and Bjorn knew better than anyone the depths of Haldor's grief. But this seemed like madness born of sorrow. Eric is dead, my friend, Bjorn said gently, placing a massive hand on Haldor's shoulder. We burned his ship ourselves, sent him to Valhalla with all the honors due a warrior. These dreams they are, but your heart's refusal to accept what cannot be changed. Then explain this, Haldor replied, pulling the silver wolf pendant from beneath his tunic. The medallion seemed to pulse with its own inner light, growing warm in his palm as gasps arose from the gathered villagers. Eric's pendant grows warm when the dreams come, and warmer still as we approach the forest. Tell me, old friend, do the dead speak through silver and stone? Astrid stepped forward from where she had been, standing at the crowd's edge, her presence causing several villagers to make protective signs against evil. I have seen the boy in my visions, she said, her clear voice cutting through the murmur of concerned voices. He is not in Valhalla, nor does he rest in Hell's domain. He remains bound to this world, trapped in a place of shadow and ancient sorrow. Ingrid Stormcrow's eyes narrowed as she studied the healer. And what would you know of such things, Astrid Thorsdottir? Your visions have brought nothing but ill fortune to our village. My visions speak truth, whether that truth brings comfort or sorrow, Astrid replied without flinching. Eric guards something in the heart of the Darkwood, something that connects to wounds older than our village, older than memory itself. His father's love calls to him, yes, but it is not rescue he seeks. Thorvald, the law speaker, stepped forward, his face grave with the weight of tradition. The laws of our people are clear. The Darkwood is forbidden territory, cursed by deeds done in the time of legends. Any who enter that place bring doom upon themselves and their kin. I cannot permit this journey. You cannot forbid it either, Haldor replied, his voice carrying the edge of steel that had once commanded respect on a dozen battlefields. I am a free man, bound by no lord save my own conscience. If I choose to seek my son in the realm of shadows, that choice is mine alone to make. The pendant in his hands pulsed again, stronger this time, and with it came a sensation that made several sensitive villagers step back in alarm. The air itself seemed to shimmer, and for just a moment so brief that some later claimed it was merely a trick of the light, a young man's figure could be seen standing at the forest's edge, beckoning. Eric, Haldor whispered, and the love in his voice was so profound that even the most skeptical villagers felt their hearts clench with sympathy. Astrid moved to stand beside him, her hands clasped around a small leather pouch that contained her grandmother's runestones. The spirits grow restless, she said quietly. Something stirs in the Darkwood, something that has waited long for this moment. If we do not answer now, the opportunity may never come again. Old Gunnar shook his head slowly, his expression heavy with foreboding. You ask us to approve your doom, Haldor. The stories of that cursed forest speak of travelers who entered and never returned, of voices that lead the living astray, of ancient grudges that devour all who stumble into their web. Then let us know these stories, Haldor said. If we are to face this danger, we should understand what we walk toward. The crowd grew quiet as Gunnar gathered his thoughts, his ancient memory reaching back through generations of oral tradition. When he spoke, his voice carried the cadence of the storytellers who had passed down these tales through the long winter nights. In the time before memory, when the gods still walked among mortals, two great families made their homes where the Darkwood now stands. The forest was green then, full of life and light, a place where children played and lovers met beneath starlit skies. But pride and jealousy poisoned the hearts of both houses, and what began as a simple misunderstanding grew into a blood feud that consumed everything. He paused, his eyes distant with the weight of ancient sorrow. The patriarchs of both families met in single combat in the heart of the wood, and their battle was so fierce, their hatred so pure, that it poisoned the very earth beneath their feet. Both men died that day, but their anger lived on, seeping into root and branch, until the entire forest became a monument to wrath and regret. Since that day, Ingrid added, her voice barely above a whisper, the Darkwood has been a place of shadows and sorrow. Some say the spirits of the feuding families still walk its paths, doomed to replay their ancient grievances until the end of time. Others claim the forest itself has become a living thing, feeding on the negative emotions of any who dare enter its bounds. Astrid's grip tightened on her runestones as a vision flashed before her eyes. Two men locked in mortal combat, while around them a verdant paradise withered and died. But there was something else, something the elders' stories had forgotten, or perhaps never known. In her vision, she saw children watching from the shadows, young souls who had tried to stop the madness and had been consumed by it instead. The stories speak truth, she said slowly, but not the whole truth. There is more to this tale than ancient hatred. There are innocent souls trapped in that place, victims of a conflict they tried to heal rather than fuel. She looked directly at Haldor. Your son may be among them. The revelation hung in the air like storm clouds before a gale. Several villagers began to back away, their faces pale with superstitious fear. But Haldor felt only a growing certainty that this path, dangerous as it might be, was the one he was meant to walk. We leave at dawn, he announced, his voice carrying the finality of a man who has made his peace with destiny. I will carry provisions for a 7-day journey and weapons to face whatever guards the forest's heart. Any who would speak against this choice should do so now, for after the sun rises, I will hear no more counsel." The crowd began to disperse, some muttering prayers for his soul, others shaking their heads at what they saw as a fool's errand born of grief. But Bjorn remained, his loyal heart warring with his practical mind. "If you are determined to walk this path," he said finally, "then at least accept the blessing of the gods." He pressed a small hammer pendant into Haldor's hand, the symbol of Thor, protector of mortal men. "May the Thunderer watch over you in the dark places of the world." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Haldor and Dark, Astrid made their preparations. Food and water, warm cloaks and sturdy boots, protective charms and healing herbs, all the tools mortals might need to survive in a realm where the natural laws held less sway than the weight of ancient sorrows. The wolf pendant grew warmer with each passing hour, as if responding to their resolve. And in the distance, barely visible through the evening mist, the dark line of the cursed forest waited like a threshold between worlds. Their true journey was about to begin. Dawn came grey and reluctant over Ravenshollow, as if the sun itself hesitated to witness what was about to unfold. Haldor stood at the village's northern gate, his pack secured across his broad shoulders and his battle-axe hanging at his side. Not for combat, he hoped, but for the comfort that familiar weight provided. Astrid approached through the morning mist, moving with the quiet purpose of someone who had spent years walking paths others feared to tread. She carried a strange device Haldor had never seen before, a circular bronze disc inscribed with runes and fitted with a needle that trembled and turned as if seeking something beyond magnetic north. The artifact seemed ancient, its surface green with age and etched with symbols that hurt to look at directly. "My grandmother's compass," Astrid explained, noting his curious gaze. "It does not point toward the cardinal directions, but towards souls in need. She used it to find lost children and wounded travelers, but I fear it may guide us towards something far more dangerous." As they approached the forest's edge, the device began to hum, a low, almost inaudible vibration that seemed to resonate in their bones. The needle spun wildly for a moment before settling on a bearing that led directly into the heart of the darkwood. The transformation from meadowland to cursed forest was startling in its abruptness. One moment they walked through familiar grassland dotted with wildflowers, and the next they stood before a wall of twisted trees whose branches intertwined like gnarled fingers, reaching toward a sky they could no longer touch. The air grew cold, despite the season, and the cheerful birdsong that had accompanied their journey fell silent. Eric's pendant, hanging against Haldor's chest, grew warm enough that he could feel its heat through his tunic. The sensation was both comforting and unsettling proof that his son's presence waited somewhere ahead, but also a reminder that they were stepping beyond the realm where ordinary laws held sway. "The path changes once we enter," Astrid warned, her voice barely above a whisper. "The forest reshapes itself according to the intentions of those who walk its trails. Stay close, and do not trust your eyes completely. This place has its own will, and it tests all who dare disturb its slumber." They crossed the threshold together, and immediately Haldor felt the world shift around them. The straight game trail they had been following began to curve and wind in ways that defied the landscape they had observed from outside. Trees that had seemed 20 paces away suddenly loomed overhead, while clearings that appeared nearby receded like mirages when approached. "How does a man navigate such madness?" Haldor asked, his warrior's mind struggling to accept what his eyes reported. "By trusting something beyond sight," Astrid replied, holding up the whispering compass. Its needle pointed steadily ahead despite the disorienting shifts in their surroundings. "The device seeks truth, not illusion. As long as we follow its guidance, we will find what we came here to discover." The deeper they penetrated into the forest, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their bark blackened as if by ancient fires. No undergrowth survived in this shadow realm, only bare earth covered with a carpet of leaves that never seemed to decay. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft shuffle of their footsteps and the increasingly urgent hum of the compass. After what felt like hours, but could have been minutes in this place where time seemed malleable, they stumbled upon the remains of a camp. The sight stopped them both short, for here was evidence that others had ventured into the darkwood and paid a price for their boldness. The camp showed signs of hasty abandonment, scattered belongings, cold fire pits, and supplies left to rot in the perpetual twilight. But most disturbing were the weapons that lay scattered about, all showing signs of desperate use. Axes with chipped blades, shields split by tremendous force, and spears snapped like kindling told a story of violence that made even Haldor's battle-hardened spirit recoil. "Vikings," he said, kneeling to examine a broken sword whose pommel bore the mark of a clan he recognized. These men were from the coastal settlements, raiders who must have heard the same legends we know. Astrid picked up a leather journal from beside one of the abandoned packs, its pages swollen with moisture but still legible. As she read, her face grew pale. They came seeking treasure, believing the cursed forest must guard some ancient hoard. The entries speak of whispers in the darkness, of shapes that moved just beyond the edge of vision, of growing certainty that they were being hunted by something that understood their thoughts before they formed them. The final entry, written in a shaking hand, chilled them both. "The trees speak with our voices now. We hear our mothers calling, our lovers weeping, our children crying for help. But when we follow these sounds, we find only empty clearings and the growing certainty that we are being led deeper into a trap we cannot escape. The compass spins wildly north is everywhere and nowhere. We are lost, and I fear we were lost the moment we entered this accursed place." Eric's pendant pulsed against Haldor's chest, and with its warmth came something unexpected, his son's voice, clear and reassuring despite the fear that gripped his heart. "Father, do not let their fate become yours. The forest feeds on desperation and greed, but you walk here for love. That makes all the difference." Haldor's head snapped up, his eyes scanning the twisted trees for any sign of his son's presence. But there was nothing, only the endless twilight and the oppressive weight of ancient sorrow that seemed to press down upon them like a physical force. "Did you hear that?" he asked Astrid, who was studying her compass with growing concern. "I heard your son's love," she replied carefully, "but also something else. The forest tests us now, measuring our resolve and seeking the cracks in our determination. These other men failed because they came for the wrong reasons. But we must be stronger than their greed, wiser than their pride." As if summoned by her words, shapes began to move in their peripheral vision, not quite human, not quite animal, but something that suggested both. The abandoned weapons around them began to rust visibly, their metal corroding as if decades were passing in moments. The very air seemed to thicken, making each breath an effort. "The forest remembers," Astrid whispered, her grip tightening on the compass. "It remembers every soul that has entered, seeking to take rather than to give, to conquer rather than to heal. These raiders awakened something that had been sleeping, and now it watches us with the same suspicion." But the whispering compass continued to point steadily ahead, its needle unwavering despite the chaos around them. And Eric's pendant grew warmer still, as if his son's spirit was drawing them forward through the maze of illusion and despair. "We continue," Haldor said, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at his resolve. "Whatever fate befell these men, it will not be ours. We walk a different path, guided by love rather than greed." As they left the cursed campsite behind, the forest seemed to shift around them once more. But this time, Haldor thought he glimpsed something new in the shadows, a flicker of movement that felt familiar, protective rather than threatening. His son was near. He was certain of it now, and that certainty gave him the strength to face whatever trials awaited them in the deeper darkness ahead. The second day in the darkwood brought revelations that cut deeper than any blade. As they pressed forward, Following the unwavering guidance of Astrid's compass, the forest began to speak to them in ways that transcended mere sound. Ancient runes carved into the massive tree trunks told stories of love and loss, of promises made and broken, of hearts that had chosen destruction over healing. Haldor paused before one particularly large oak, whose bark bore symbols that seemed to shift and change as he watched them. The markings were old, older than the village, older perhaps than the feuding families whose hatred had poisoned this place, but somehow he could read them as clearly as if they had been carved yesterday. "Here lies the sundered grove," the runes proclaimed, where healing turned to harm, where the gentle voice was silenced by the roar of rage. Astrid joined him, her fingers tracing the carved symbols with a reverence that spoke of deep understanding. "These are warning markers," she said softly, "but not warnings to stay away, warnings about what we carry within ourselves. The grove ahead tests not our courage, but our willingness to face the parts of ourselves we would rather keep hidden." As if responding to her words, something shifted in Haldor's pack. He reached back and withdrew an object he had forgotten. He carried a carved stone that had belonged to his beloved wife, Sigrid. She had used it as a weight for her loom, and after her death in childbirth, Haldor had kept it as a reminder of the gentle woman who had shown him that strength could be tender, that power could be protective rather than destructive. The stone began to pulse with the same warm energy as Eric's pendant, and suddenly the air around them filled with the sound of feminine laughter, not mocking or cruel, but full of the joy Sigrid had brought to even the darkest moments of their life together. The laughter seemed to awaken something in the forest itself, as if the ancient trees remembered a time when such sounds had been common in this place. "Sigrid loved to weave," Haldor said, his voice thick with emotion as memories flooded back. "She said that every thread told a story, and when woven together properly, those stories could create something beautiful enough to warm the coldest heart." He paused, looking around at the twisted trees with new understanding. She tried to teach Eric the same lesson, that strength and gentleness were not opposites, but partners in creating something greater than either could achieve alone. The revelation hit him like a physical blow. Eric had not been weak, as Haldor had sometimes feared. His son had simply inherited his mother's understanding that true power lay not in conquering others, but in healing the wounds that poisoned the world around them. All those times Haldor had pushed Eric toward the warrior's path. His son had been trying to show him a different way, a way of strength that built rather than destroyed. Astrid watched the play of emotions across his weathered features with the compassion of someone who understood the weight of regret. "Your wife saw what you are only now beginning to understand," she said gently. Eric was never meant to be a warrior in the traditional sense. His battles were fought with different weapons: compassion against hatred, forgiveness against revenge, understanding against ignorance. The forest around them began to change as these truths settled into Haldor's heart. The oppressive atmosphere lightened slightly, and for the first time since entering the Darkwood, they heard the sound of running water, a stream that had not been there moments before, as if their emotional breakthrough had called it into being. As they followed the newly appeared waterway, the trees grew less twisted, their branches reaching toward slivers of actual sky visible through the canopy. But with this improvement came new challenges, for the forest was not content to let them pass without testing their newfound understanding. Phantom voices began to echo through the woods, conversations from years past that felt as real as if they were happening in the present moment. Haldor heard himself arguing with Eric about the boy's reluctance to join the practice battles with other youth his age. He heard the pain in his son's voice as Eric tried to explain that he found no joy in violence, even the mock violence of training. "Why can you not understand, father?" The phantom, Eric pleaded, his young voice carrying across the years with perfect clarity. "I do not wish to hurt others, even in play. There must be other ways to prove one's worth. Strength is the only currency that matters in this world." The phantom, Haldor replied, his voice harsh with the certainty he had once felt. "Men who cannot fight are at the mercy of those who can. I will not see you made into a victim of your own gentleness. But now, walking through this forest of memories and regrets, Haldor could hear what he had missed in that long-ago conversation, the desperate love in Eric's voice, the boy's attempt to bridge the gap between his father's expectations and his own nature. Eric had not been rejecting strength, he had been trying to redefine it. Astrid touched his arm gently as the phantom voices faded. The forest shows us these memories not to torment us, but to help us understand what we must heal within ourselves before we can heal anything else. She pulled her own loom weight from her pack, a piece of carved amber that had belonged to her grandmother, the woman who had first taught her to listen to the spirit world. As she held it up to catch the filtered sunlight, the amber revealed something hidden within its golden depths, a single tear, crystallized and preserved across generations. My grandmother wept this tear the day she realized her gift would make her an outcast, Astrid said softly. She had seen the plague coming and tried to warn the village, but they called her mad until the sickness proved her right. By then, it was too late to save many lives, and she blamed herself for not finding a way to make them listen. The tear within the amber began to glow, and suddenly they could both see the network of pain that connected all the souls trapped in this forest. Generations of people who had died with words unspoken, love unexpressed, forgiveness withheld. The Darkwood was not merely cursed by the ancient feud between two families. It had become a repository for every form of emotional wound that refused to heal. Eric did not come here by accident, Astrid realized, her voice filled with wonder and sorrow. He was drawn to this place because his spirit recognized what it truly was, not a forest of the damned, but a hospital for broken hearts. He remained here not because he was trapped, but because he chose to tend to wounds that others had given up as hopeless. The compass in her hands spun wildly for a moment before pointing toward a path that had not existed moments before. A trail marked not by broken branches or worn earth, but by flowers that bloomed despite the perpetual twilight. White lilies and forget-me-nots, the flowers Sigrid had loved best, created a pathway deeper into the forest's heart. As they began to follow this new trail, both felt the weight of understanding settling upon them. They had entered the Darkwood, seeking to rescue Eric, but they were beginning to realize that perhaps it was Eric who had been trying to rescue them from their fears, their regrets, and their inability to see that healing was a form of heroism far greater than any victory won through violence. The true test still lay ahead, but they walked toward it now with hearts more open than they had been in years. The third day brought them to the heart of the Darkwood, where reality grew thin as morning mist, and the boundaries between past and present dissolved like salt in water. The flower-marked path had led them to a circular clearing dominated by a tree so massive that its trunk could have housed an entire longhouse. But this ancient giant was dead, its bark blackened and its branches reaching toward the sky like the skeletal fingers of some primordial god. At the base of the great tree lay scattered bones, not the remains of any creature that had ever walked the earth, but carved pieces of ivory and antler inscribed with runes that seemed to write themselves as Haldor and Astrid watched. The bone fragments arranged and rearranged themselves in patterns that spelled out messages from realms beyond mortal understanding. Astrid whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and trepidation. My grandmother spoke of such things in her most private teachings, artifacts left by the first wise women, tools for speaking with those who have passed beyond the veil of death. As they approached the ancient tree, the bones began to move with greater urgency, clicking against each other with sounds like wind chimes made from sorrow itself. The runes they formed were clear enough to read, though the messages they spelled cut deeper than any blade. Welcome, children of the sundered bloodlines. Long have we waited for hearts brave enough to seek healing rather than revenge. Haldor felt Eric's pendant grow almost burning hot against his chest. And suddenly, his son's voice rang out clear and strong, no longer the distant whisper they had heard before, but as present, as if the young man stood beside them. "Father, you have come so far already, but the hardest part of the journey lies ahead. Are you ready to learn why I chose to remain in this place?" The bones rearranged themselves again, spelling out a new message that made both travelers step back in shock. The ancient feud that cursed this forest was not between strangers, but between the bloodlines of Astrid Thorsdottir and Halldor Eriksson. "You are the last children of families who swore eternal enmity, and only through your choice can that enmity finally end." The revelation struck them both like lightning from a clear sky. Astrid's face went pale as she reached for the leather pouch containing her grandmother's runestones, her fingers trembling as she poured them onto the ground. The stones arranged themselves into patterns she had never seen before, patterns that told a story of love turned to hatred, of promises broken and curses spoken in the heat of righteous anger. "My ancestor was Astrid Ravencaller," she said, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the prosy, dead trees' branches. "The stories say she was a Volva of great power who could speak with spirits and see the threads that connected all living things. But the family histories never explained why she left her home to live as an outcast in the deep forests." Haldor's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of his own family's oral traditions. "Haldor the Bone Crusher was my ancestor, a warrior whose strength was legendary, even among the most fearsome Vikings. But the old songs always mentioned a great sorrow that drove him to seek death in battle rather than live with the weight of his regret." The Bone Oracle continued its grim revelation, the carved pieces spelling out the truth that had been buried beneath generations of carefully edited stories. Astrid Ravencaller and Haldor the Bone Crusher were lovers who planned to unite their rival clans through marriage. But on the eve of their wedding, a misunderstanding born of pride and jealousy turned celebration into bloodshed. Both called upon the gods to curse their former beloved, and the gods, in their terrible justice, granted both prayers. The forest became a monument to their mutual destruction, and all their descendants were doomed to carry the weight of that ancient hatred until love proved stronger than the desire for revenge. The weight of this knowledge pressed down upon them like a physical force. They were not merely two individuals seeking to rescue a lost soul. They were the culmination of a story that had been centuries in the telling. The final chance for two bloodlines to choose healing over the perpetuation of ancient wounds. Eric's voice spoke again, and this time they could see him not solid, but present enough that the love in his eyes was unmistakable. "This is why I could not rest in Valhalla, Father. This is why I chose to remain here, guarding the place where our family's greatest failure took root. I have been waiting for you to find the courage to face this truth." "But why us?" Haldor asked, his voice raw with emotion. "Why must we bear the burden of choices made by people we never knew?" "Because you are the first of both bloodlines to enter this place with love instead of hatred," Eric replied, his spirit form growing more solid as his words rang with truth. "Every other descendant who found their way here came seeking to break the curse through violence or magical force. But you came seeking to heal a relationship, not to win a victory. That makes all the difference." Astrid knelt beside the Bone Oracle, her hands hovering over the carved pieces as she felt the weight of her ancestry settling upon her shoulders. "What must we do?" she asked. "How do we heal wounds that have festered for so many generations?" The bones rearranged themselves one final time, their message simple but terrifying in its implications. Face the truth of what love demands. Choose forgiveness over justice, understanding over righteousness, healing over the satisfaction of being proven right. The dead tree began to show signs of life, tiny green buds appearing on branches that had been barren for centuries. But with this sign of hope came a new challenge, for the forest itself seemed to resist the possibility of healing. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the air filled with the sound of voices from the past generations. of descendants who had been raised on stories of justified hatred, who had built their identities around the righteousness of their anger. "They will not let you heal this easily," Eric warned, his form beginning to flicker as other spirits pressed close around them. "The dead who have fed on this hatred for so long will fight to preserve it. You must be stronger than their desperation, wiser than their certainty that revenge is the only path to peace." As if summoned by his words, the clearing began to fill with ghostly figures, the spirits of all who had died carrying the burden of the ancient feud. Their faces were twisted with the pain of lives spent in service to hatred they had inherited rather than chosen, and their voices rose in a chorus of lamentation that spoke of centuries of wasted love and squandered opportunities for reconciliation. The final test was about to begin, and both Haldor and Astrid knew that failure would mean not just their own destruction, but the eternal perpetuation of a curse that had already claimed too many innocent hearts. The ghostly chorus of their ancestors pressed closer, and with their approach came a phenomenon that froze both Haldor and Astrid in place, a pool of water that had not been there moments before, its surface so still and clear that it seemed less like liquid than a window into the deepest chambers of the human heart. The truth mirror, as Eric called it with reverence that bordered on fear, reflected not their physical forms, but the essence of who they truly were beneath all pretense and self-deception. "Look upon yourselves, as the gods see you," Eric urged, his spirit form growing more solid as the supernatural forces in the clearing reached their crescendo. "Only by facing what you truly are can you hope to become what you must be." Haldor approached the pool first, his warrior's courage serving him even in this realm where strength of arm meant nothing. But what he saw in the water's depths drove him to his knees with a grief so profound that it threatened to tear his soul apart. The reflection showed not the mighty warrior he had always believed himself to be, but a frightened man who had used violence as a shield against the vulnerability that love demanded. He saw himself as a young father, holding his newborn son and feeling terrified by the overwhelming need to protect this tiny life. That fear had driven him to teach Eric the only language he knew, the language of conquest and domination. But in trying to make his son strong enough to survive in a harsh world, he had nearly destroyed the very qualities that made Eric who he was. "I never told him I was proud of his gentleness," Haldor whispered, tears falling into the pool and causing ripples that showed even deeper truths. "I never said that his questions were wise, that his reluctance to hurt others was a strength rather than a weakness. I spent so many years trying to make him into a copy of myself that I never took the time to discover who he actually was." The water showed him memory after memory moments when Eric had tried to share his thoughts about the Tay, stories he loved, the healing herbs he had learned about from watching Astrid from afar, the songs he composed in secret because he feared his father would find them unmanly. All those opportunities for connection, squandered because Haldor had been too afraid to admit that his son might be wiser than he was. Astrid knelt beside him, her own reflection revealing truths just as painful. The mirror showed her not as the wise healer she presented to the world, but as a woman who had chosen isolation over the risk of being hurt again. Her gifts had made her an outcast, yes, but she had also used that exile as protection against the possibility of losing someone she cared about. "I could have helped him," she said, her voice breaking as she watched scenes of Eric as a child, secretly gathering herbs and trying to heal injured animals, while his father pushed him toward the practice fields. "I saw his nature, recognized the gift he carried, but I was too afraid of being rejected again to reach out to him. I let my own pain matter more than his need for understanding." The truth mirror showed her the moments when Eric had lingered near her cottage, hoping for some sign of acceptance or guidance. She had seen him there but had chosen to remain hidden, unwilling to risk the village's increased displeasure if they discovered she was influencing the Jarl's son. Her gift for seeing the future had shown her the boy's destiny, but her cowardice had prevented her from helping him prepare for it. "Both of you failed him," Eric's voice said, but without condemnation, only the sadness of a son who had needed more than either parent was able to give. But your failures were born of fear, not malice. And now you have the chance to transform that fear into something greater. The spirits of their ancestors grew more agitated as these truths emerged, their forms becoming more solid and threatening. The ancient Astrid Ravencaller materialized beside the pool, her beautiful face twisted with centuries of accumulated bitterness. "Do not listen to the boy's pretty words," she hissed, her voice carrying the authority of one who had once commanded the respect of gods. "Haldor the Bone Crusher promised me forever, swore oaths that should have bound his soul to mine for all eternity. When he broke those vows, he proved that no descendant of his line can ever be trusted." Beside her, the spirit of Haldor the Bone Crusher appeared, his massive form radiating the kind of rage that had once leveled entire villages. "She speaks poison, as she always did. It was her jealousy that destroyed our love, her inability to trust that turned celebration into slaughter. No child of her blood will ever understand the meaning of true loyalty." The ghostly couple began to argue with the same passion that had doomed them centuries ago, their voices rising until the very air seemed to crack with the force of their mutual hatred. Other spirits joined them, generations of descendants who had inherited this feud like a sacred trust, each adding their own grievances to the chorus of ancient wrongs. But as the spectral argument reached its peak, something unexpected happened. The truth mirror began to show not just individual failures, but the connections between all the souls trapped in this place. Like Astrid's grandmother's loom, the water revealed the threads that bound every spirit to every other threads of love corrupted into hate, of protection twisted into possessiveness, of passion transformed into poison. They are all in pain, Astrid realized, her healer's instincts finally overcoming her fear. Every single one of them is trapped by the same wounds we carry, the inability to forgive themselves for not being perfect, for not being able to love without hurting those they care about most. Eric's spirit moved between his father and Astrid, his form glowing brighter as understanding dawned. "This is why I chose to remain here, why I could not rest while so many souls suffered. The curse is not punishment. It is a hospital for hearts that were too broken to heal on their own. But it requires living souls to choose healing over revenge, forgiveness over justice." The revelation hung in the air like a bridge between worlds. All around them, the arguing spirits fell silent as they felt the possibility of release, not through victory over their ancient enemies, but through the simple act of choosing to let go, of grievances that had poisoned centuries of potential love. "The choice is yours," Eric said, his eyes moving between his father and Astrid. "You can join the chorus of blame and add your voices to the eternal argument. Or you can show all these lost souls that there is another way, that love is stronger than the need to be right, that healing is more important than being understood." The truth mirror rippled again, showing them one final vision themselves, as they could become, if they chose the path of forgiveness, and the legacy of healing they could leave for future generations who would never have to carry the burden of inherited hatred. The moment of choice had arrived. The silence that followed Eric's words stretched like a taut bowstring, heavy with the weight of decision. But as Haldor reached toward his son's spirit, something extraordinary happened that shattered every assumption they had carried into the dark wood. Ethereal chains materialized in the air around, them not binding Eric, but connecting every soul in the clearing, in an intricate web of shared pain that stretched back through generations. The soul-binding chains, as they revealed themselves to be, were visible only to those with the sight to perceive them, but once seen, they explained everything. Each link in the spectral bonds represented a choice made in anger rather than love, a moment when someone had chosen to nurse a grievance rather than seek understanding. The chains bound not just the original feuding lovers, but every descendant who had inherited their story and chosen to perpetuate it rather than transform it. "Father," Eric said, his voice carrying a sorrow deeper than any grave, "I must tell you the truth. I have hidden even from myself. I am not trapped here against my will. I chose to remain, not because I was lost or confused, but because I finally understood my purpose." The revelation struck Haldor like a physical blow. "What are you saying, my son?" Eric's form grew more solid as he spoke, his young face bearing the wisdom of one who had spent years contemplating the deepest mysteries of existence. "When I died in that monastery raid, I was given a choice to go to Valhalla and feast with the heroes, or to come here and serve as a guardian for all the souls trapped by inherited hatred. I chose this place, Father, because I knew that someday you would come looking for me, and when you did, you would have the power to break chains that have bound our families for centuries." Astrid felt her legs give way as the full implications of Eric's words sank in. "You mean you have been waiting here, alone, all this time, not because you needed rescue, but because you were trying to rescue us?" "Not just you," Eric replied, gesturing to the web of chains that surrounded them. "All of us. Every soul trapped in this cycle of blame and resentment. Look closely at the chains, and you will see something that even the ancient spirits have forgotten." As they focused their attention on the ethereal bonds, the chains began to reveal their true nature. What had appeared to be instruments of imprisonment were actually lifelines, connections between souls that could carry either poison or healing, depending on the choices made by those who held them. Each link glowed with a different color: red for anger, black for despair, gray for indifference. But some links pulsed with gold, representing moments when love had been chosen over hate, forgiveness over revenge. "The curse can only be broken by willing sacrifice from both bloodlines," Eric continued, his voice growing stronger as understanding dawned in his listeners' eyes. "But the sacrifice is not what you think. It is not about giving up your lives or your happiness. It is about giving up the right to be victims, the comfort of righteous anger, the safety of blaming others for your pain." Haldor's warrior mind reeled as he tried to process this complete reversal of everything he had believed about their mission. "You are saying that to save you, you must save yourselves," Eric interrupted gently. "And in doing so, you will save everyone else. The chains that bind the dead can only be broken by the living choosing to forge new connections based on love rather than fear." The ancient spirits around them began to wail as they sensed what was coming. For centuries, they had fed on the emotional energy generated by the perpetual conflict between the bloodlines. The thought of that energy being transformed into something healing rather than destructive filled them with existential terror. "You cannot ask this of us," shrieked the spirit of Astrid Ravencaller. "We have nursed these wounds for so long that they have become who we are. Without our righteous anger, without our justified pain, what will be left of us?" "Peace," Eric said simply. "Release, the chance to rest at last, instead of endlessly reliving the same arguments, the same hurts, the same cycles of retaliation." But even as he spoke, the forest itself began to resist the possibility of healing. The ground shook, and the air filled with a sound, like the screaming of wind through broken stones. The Darkwood had become more than just a repository for ancient grief. It had become a living entity that sustained itself on the negative emotions of those trapped within its boundaries. "The forest will fight you," Eric warned, his form beginning to flicker as the supernatural forces around them reached a crescendo. "It has grown fat on centuries of hatred and despair. To heal this place, you must be willing to starve it of the very emotions it craves." Astrid felt the runestones in her pouch growing hot against her side. When she pulled them out, they were glowing with the same golden light as the positive links in the soul-binding chains. "The stones are resonating with something," she said wonderingly. "They want to be part of the healing. Your grandmother's gift," Eric explained, She imbued those stones with the wisdom she gained from a lifetime of seeing beyond the veil. They carry the memory of what this place was before hatred poisoned it, a sacred grove where lovers met, where families were united, where the living and the dead could speak with one another in peace. The implications of the revelation were staggering. They had not come to rescue Eric from a prison, they had come to learn from him how to transform a hell into a hospital, how to change a monument to hatred into a shrine to healing. But the cost, Haldor whispered, finally understanding the magnitude of what was being asked of them. To break these chains, we must forgive not only our ancestors but ourselves. We must give up the comfort of being wronged, the identity we have built around our pain. Yes, Eric said, his love for his father shining in his eyes like starlight. And we must do it before the winter solstice seals the curse forever. The ancient magic that created this place draws its power from the darkest day of the year. If the chains are not broken by sunset on the solstice, they will become permanent, and all of us living and dead will be trapped here for eternity. The urgency of their situation crystallized around them like ice forming on still water. They had perhaps hours, not days, to accomplish what generations of their ancestors had failed to achieve. And the price of failure was not just their own destruction, but the eternal suffering of every soul connected to their bloodlines. "How do we begin?" Astrid asked, though she feared she already knew the answer. "With the hardest words in any language," Eric replied. "We begin by saying, 'I forgive you' to those who have hurt us most. And then we say, 'I forgive myself for the ways we have failed those we love.'" As if summoned by his words, the ancient lovers materialized before them. Astrid Ravencaller and Haldor the Bone Crusher, their forms more solid than they, had appeared before, their faces bearing the accumulated pain of centuries spent in mutual recrimination. "You ask the impossible," Haldor the Bone Crusher snarled, his spectral hand resting on the pommel of a sword that dripped with spiritual poison. "She betrayed everything we had built together. She deserves no forgiveness." And he proved himself a faithless dog who would abandon love the moment it required. True courage. Astrid Ravencaller replied, her beautiful features twisted with the kind of rage that could burn down worlds. "Some wounds are too deep to heal." But even as they spoke, their words of eternal enmity, the soul-binding chains around them pulsed with possibility. For the first time in centuries, living representatives of both bloodlines stood ready to choose a different path. The moment of ultimate choice had arrived, and with it came the knowledge that whatever they decided in the next few hours would echo through eternity. The winter solstice dawn broke grey and reluctant over the dark wood, as if the sun itself was hesitant to witness what was about to unfold in the cursed grove. Frost covered every surface with crystalline patterns that looked disturbingly like the soul-binding chains they had discovered the night before, and the air carried a bite that seemed to reach directly into their bones. Haldor had not slept. How could he, knowing that his son had sacrificed his eternal rest to guard this place of ancient sorrows? The weight of that revelation pressed down upon him like a mountain, reshaping his understanding of everything he thought he knew about love, duty, and what it truly meant to be strong. Astrid moved through the grove with the purposeful grace of one preparing for the most important ritual of her life. In her hands, she carried a circlet woven from winter branches, hawthorn and oak, elderberry and rowan that had appeared at the base of the great dead tree as the first light touched the clearing. The solstice crown, Eric had called it, explaining that it would mark the one chosen to guide the ritual of release. The crown chooses its bearer, Eric's spirit had said as Astrid lifted the woven branches with trembling hands. It has waited centuries for someone with both the sight to see what must be done and the courage to do it, regardless of the personal cost. Now, as the pale winter sun climbed toward its brief zenith, the crown seemed to pulse with its own inner light. Each branch carried the memory of what this place had been. Before hatred took root, a sacred grove where the living and the dead could meet in peace, where love was celebrated rather than destroyed, where forgiveness flowed like spring water after a long winter. The ancient spirits had gathered in a circle around the massive tree, their forms more solid than they had ever been before. The proximity to the solstice gave them strength, but it also made their pain more acute. Centuries of nursing their grievances had become their only identity, and the prospect of releasing that familiar anguish filled them with something beyond fear, a kind of existential terror at the thought of discovering who they might be without their carefully tended wounds. Haldor knelt before the truth mirror, its surface now showing not just reflections, but glimpses of possible futures. In one vision, he saw himself walking away from the grove unchanged, carrying his grief like a familiar burden back to Ravenshollow, where he would live out his days as a monument to lost possibilities. In another, he saw the chains of ancient hatred growing stronger, spreading beyond the forest to poison his village and eventually the entire region. But there was a third vision that made his breath catch in his throat himself, and Astrid working together to transform not just the cursed grove, but their entire understanding of what strength could be. He saw villages where healers and warriors worked as partners, where children learned that courage came in many forms, where the wisdom of the gentle heart was valued as highly as the strength of the sword arm. The choice you make today will echo through generations, Eric said, his spirit form clearer than it had been since their arrival. But you must understand, healing. This place will not bring me back to life. I cannot return to the world of the living, Father. My purpose lies elsewhere now. The words hit Haldor like a physical blow, though he had known in his heart that this truth was coming. Then what am I fighting for, my son? If I cannot bring you home, if I cannot undo the loss that has defined my life for 3 years, what is the point of this sacrifice? Eric's smile carried all the love and wisdom that had made him special, even as a child. You are fighting for the chance to transform loss into legacy, Father. You are fighting for every child who will grow up free from the burden of inherited hatred. You are fighting for the possibility that love can be stronger than death, even when it cannot overcome it. Astrid approached them both, the solstice crown now firmly settled upon her brow. The branches seemed to have grown into her hair, connecting her more deeply to the ancient magic of the place. The ritual must begin soon, she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very bones of the earth. I can feel the forest's resistance growing stronger. It knows what we intend, and it will use every weapon at its disposal to prevent us. As if summoned by her words, the temperature in the grove plummeted. Ice began forming on the surface of the truth mirror, and the soul-binding chains grew visible to all present, their weight making the very air seem thick and oppressive. The spirits of the feuding ancestors drew closer together, their ancient argument resuming with renewed intensity. You speak of forgiveness as if it were a simple thing, snarled the ghost of Haldor the Bone Crusher, his spectral form, radiating the kind of rage that had once leveled entire armies. But some betrayals cut too deep for healing. Some wounds are meant to be remembered, honored, kept alive as warnings to future generations. And you speak of love as if it were something that could survive any test, replied Astrid Ravencaller, her beautiful features twisted with centuries of accumulated bitterness. But love is fragile, easily broken, and once shattered, the pieces only cut deeper with each attempt to reassemble them. The argument between the ancient lovers grew more heated, and with their rising voices came a sound that chilled the blood, the howling of wind through the forest, carrying with it the voices of every soul that had ever died nursing a grievance. The Darkwood itself was awakening, preparing to defend its existence by overwhelming them with the accumulated weight of every unhealed wound it had collected over the centuries. The forest is calling upon its reserves, Eric warned, his son, form beginning to flicker as the supernatural forces around them reach toward their peak. Every spirit it has trapped, every ghost it has fed upon, every soul that has chosen despair over hope, they all serve as its weapons now. But even as the forces of ancient hatred marshaled themselves, Haldor felt something stirring within his chest. The wolf pendant that had belonged to Eric was growing warm again, but this time the heat was different. Not the desperate pull of a lost soul crying for help, but the steady, comforting warmth of a beacon calling him home to a truth he had been afraid to face. "Eric," he said, his voice cutting through the supernatural chaos around them, "I need to tell you something I should have said long ago. I was wrong to try to make you into a copy of myself. I was wrong to value strength over kindness, conquest over healing. You were wiser at 15 than I am at 43, and I am sorry it took me so long to see that." The admission seemed to ripple through the clearing like a stone dropped into still water. The ancient spirits paused in their argument, and for just a moment the howling of the wind subsided. Astrid stepped forward, her hands clasped around her grandmother's runestones. "And I must say what I should have said years ago to you, Eric, and to every soul I could have helped but was too afraid to reach. I let my fear of rejection matter more than my duty to heal. I chose safety over service, and I am sorry for all the pain that choice has caused." The runestones in her hands began to glow, their light growing brighter as each word of acknowledgement and regret was spoken. The soul-binding chains around them pulsed in response, some of their links shifting from dark colors to the pale gold of potential transformation. Eric's spirit moved between them, his form growing more solid as their words of truth and regret fed the possibility of healing. "The hardest part is yet to come," he said gently. "Acknowledging our failures is only the beginning. Now you must forgive not only yourselves, but those who have hurt you most. You must choose to release grievances that have become part of your identity." The sun had reached its zenith now, marking the moment of greatest darkness in the year. The ritual window was open, but it would not remain so for long. As the light began its decline toward the brief afternoon, they could feel the ancient magic of the place gathering itself for one final test. The spirits of their ancestors pressed closer, their forms now so solid they seemed almost alive. The truth mirror showed not reflections, but visions of all the paths they could still choose: healing or perpetual wounding, transformation or eternal repetition, love or the comfort of familiar hatred. "Choose," whispered the wind through the ancient trees. "Choose now, while choice remains possible." The moment of ultimate decision had arrived, and with it came the knowledge that whatever happened next would determine not just their own fates, but the destiny of every soul connected to their bloodlines, stretching both backward through history and forward into a future they could still shape. The ritual of forgiveness was about to begin. The ritual began as the sun reached its brief peak and started its descent toward the winter horizon. Astrid raised her hands, the solstice crown blazing with ethereal light as she called upon forces older than memory itself. Her voice carried across the clearing with a power that seemed to emanate from the earth itself, summoning every spirit bound to this place of ancient sorrow. "Spirits of the feuding bloodlines, souls trapped by hatred and regret, hear me now," she intoned, her words resonating with harmonics that made the very air shimmer. "The cycle of retribution ends today. The chains of inherited anger will be broken by choices made in love rather than fear." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every ghost, every trapped soul, every fragment of unhealed pain that had taken refuge in the dark wood materialized in the clearing. The space filled with a multitude of spirits spanning centuries, warriors who had died cursing their enemies, lovers separated by family feuds, children who had grown up believing that hatred was their birthright. At the center of it all stood the original couple whose broken love had started the curse. Astrid Ravencaller and Haldor the Bone Crusher faced each other across the truth mirror, their forms crackling with the energy of unresolved passion turned to poison. "We will not be silenced by pretty words," the ancient Astrid declared, her voice cutting through the supernatural chorus like a blade. "Our grievances are righteous, our anger justified. We were wronged, and we will not pretend otherwise to satisfy your need for neat endings." She speaks truth, her former lover replied, his spectral hand gripping a sword that dripped with spiritual venom. Some betrayals run too deep for forgiveness. Some wounds are meant to remain open as reminders of the price of trust, given unwisely. But Haldor the Ironbreaker stepped forward, his massive frame dwarfed by the supernatural forces around him, yet somehow commanding attention through sheer moral presence. "I understand your pain," he said, his voice carrying the weight of his own 3 years of grief. "I have nursed my own wounds, fed my own anger, built my identity around the certainty that I was wronged by fate itself." He pulled Eric's pendant from his chest, holding it up so that its silver surface caught and reflected the light of the solstice crown. "But I have learned something in this place that I was too proud to see before. My son died because I taught him that strength meant never backing down from a fight. He rode to that monastery raid not because he wanted glory, but because he thought it was the only way to prove himself worthy of my love." The admission tore through the clearing, like lightning, causing several of the ancient spirits to step back in shock. Here was something they had not expected, a living man accepting responsibility for his failures, rather than blaming others for his pain. "Eric," Haldor continued, his voice breaking with emotion, "I forgive myself for not seeing your true nature. I forgive myself for trying to make you into something you were never meant to be. And I forgive you for being braver than your father, for choosing love over anger, even when it cost you everything." As the words left his lips, something miraculous happened. A flame appeared in the air above the truth mirror, not ordinary fire, but something that burned with the pure light of genuine forgiveness. The forgiveness flame, as it revealed itself to be, fed not on wood or oil, but on the release of genuine resentment and the choice to heal rather than harbor wounds. Astrid felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the flame grow brighter. "And I forgive myself," she said, her voice carrying across the clearing with crystalline clarity, "for choosing fear over service, for hiding my gifts when they could have helped, for letting my own pain matter more than the healing I could have provided." The flame expanded, its light washing over the assembled spirits with a warmth that many of them had not felt in centuries. Some of the lesser ghosts, those whose grievances were born more of loneliness than hatred, began to fade with expressions of relief and gratitude, finally free to continue their spiritual journeys. But the ancient lovers remained, their forms actually growing more solid as the forgiveness flame challenged their carefully maintained hatred. "You think your pretty fire can wash away centuries of justified anger?" Astrid Ravencaller snarled, her beautiful features twisted with rage. "You think forgiveness is some magical cure that can heal wounds this deep? Forgiveness is not about forgetting." Astrid the healer replied, stepping closer to her ancestral namesake. "It is about choosing to transform poison into medicine, to use our pain as a source of wisdom rather than a weapon against others." The forgiveness flame pulsed brighter, and Eric's spirit moved between the two groups, his form blazing with its own inner light. "The choice is before you now," he said to the ancient spirits. "You can remain trapped in this endless cycle of blame and recrimination, or you can choose the harder path, the path of healing that requires you to give up the comfort of being eternally wronged." The winter sun hung at its apex, marking the moment of greatest possibility and greatest danger. The ancient magic that had created the curse was reaching its peak, and the forces of hatred and forgiveness stood balanced on a knife's edge. The outcome hung in the balance, waiting for the final choice that would determine whether centuries of accumulated pain would be transformed into wisdom or crystallized into eternal suffering. The moment of ultimate decision crystallized around them like ice forming on still water. The forgiveness flame blazed higher, its light revealing something that made both Haldor and Astrid gasp in wonder, a golden key materializing in the air above the truth mirror, forged from their combined tears of joy and sorrow, sacrifice and hope. "The liberation key," Eric called it, his spirit form growing so bright it rivaled the solstice sun itself. "This is what breaks the final bonds," he explained, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate with the very foundations of reality. Not force, not magic in the traditional sense, but the willing sacrifice of the right to be victims. Haldor reached toward his son, his massive hands trembling with a mixture of love and loss that threatened to overwhelm him. "Eric, my boy, if I take this key, if I use it to free all these souls, will I be losing you forever?" Eric's smile carried all the wisdom and compassion that had made him special even as a child. "Father, you have already lost the boy I was. But by choosing healing over hatred, you give birth to something far greater, a legacy that will touch lives for generations to come. I am not leaving you. I am becoming part of something larger than either of us could be alone." The golden key pulsed with increasing intensity as the ancient lovers continued their eternal argument, their voices rising to a crescendo that made the very air crack with supernatural energy. But now, their words carried less conviction, as if the proximity of genuine forgiveness was undermining their certainty that hatred was the only reasonable response to betrayal. "Look at them," Astrid whispered, her healer's sight penetrating to the core of the ancient spirit's pain. "They are not evil, they are wounded. Centuries of nursing their grievances have become their only identity. They fight so hard against forgiveness because they fear that without their anger, they will simply cease to exist." Understanding flooded through Haldor like dawn breaking over dark water. These were not monsters to be defeated, but patients to be healed. Souls so damaged by their own choices that they had forgotten they were anything more than their wounds. "Astrid Ravencaller," he called out, addressing his ancestral enemy directly. "Haldor, the Bone Crusher. I see you now not as the villains of an ancient story, but as two people who loved so deeply that when that love was threatened, the pain drove you to madness." The ancient couple faltered in their argument, shocked by this unexpected perspective. For centuries, they had been defined by their roles as wronged parties in a cosmic drama. No one had ever suggested they might be something more complex, more human. "I choose to release you," Haldor continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because carrying the burden of your hatred has poisoned every generation that came after you. I release you from the obligation to be eternally wronged, and I release myself from the obligation to carry your pain." Astrid stepped forward, the solstice crown blazing with ethereal fire as she embraced her role as spiritual healer. "And I choose to see you as you truly are, not enemies, but wounded healers who forgot that their purpose was to mend rather than to break. Your love story does not have to end in tragedy. You can choose, even now, to transform your pain into wisdom." The liberation key descended toward them, its golden surface inscribed with runes that spoke of endings that were also beginnings, of deaths that gave birth to new life, of love that was stronger than the fear of being hurt again. As Haldor grasped the key, the soul-binding chains around every spirit in the clearing began to dissolve. Not breaking with violence, but simply fading away like mist before the morning sun. The chains had been forged from the choice to remain connected through hatred. Now that love had been chosen instead, they no longer had any power to bind. "I understand now," whispered Astrid Ravencaller, her spectral form beginning to shimmer with its own inner light. "We thought forgiveness meant forgetting, meant pretending we had not been hurt. But it means something else entirely. It means choosing to remember with love instead of anger. It means," added Haldor, the Bone Crusher, his ancient rage finally giving way to something that looked remarkably like relief, choosing to trust that love is stronger than betrayal, that healing is possible even for wounds we thought were permanent. The two ancient lovers looked at each other across the centuries of accumulated pain, and for the first time since their tragic misunderstanding had torn them apart, they truly saw each other not as sources of pain, but as mirrors, reflecting their own capacity for both love and forgiveness. "Can you forgive me?" the ancient Astrid asked, her voice small and uncertain, like a child seeking reassurance. "Can you forgive yourself?" the ancient Haldor replied, offering her his hand across the space that had separated them for so long. As their spectral fingers touched, both began to dissolve into light, not dying, but transforming into something greater than the sum of their individual pain. The curse that had held the Darkwood in its grip for centuries was finally broken, and with its breaking came a sound like the first breath of spring after the longest winter. The liberation key completed its work, and every trapped soul in the clearing found themselves free to continue their spiritual journeys, blessed rather than cursed by the love that had finally learned to heal rather than hurt. The journey back to Ravenshollow felt like walking through a world reborn. Where the Darkwood had once stood, twisted and malevolent, now stretched a forest alive with possibility. Sunlight filtered through leaves that had grown green overnight, and the path beneath their feet was carpeted with wild flowers that bloomed despite the winter season. The very air seemed lighter, cleansed of the oppressive weight that had pressed down upon this place for centuries. Haldor carried in his pack a smooth river stone that had appeared at the base of the great tree as the last of the freed spirits faded into light. The memory stone, Eric had called it before his own spirit finally found peace, promised to hold the essence of their journey so that the lessons learned would never be forgotten. It was warm to the touch, pulsing gently like a sleeping heart, and whenever Haldor held it, he could hear his son's voice speaking words of love and wisdom. "The villagers will not believe what we have witnessed," Astrid said as they crested the final hill before Ravenshollow came into view. The solstice crown had faded with the breaking of the curse, but something of its power remained in her eyes, a depth of understanding that spoke of one who had looked beyond the veil of ordinary reality and found hope waiting there. "Perhaps they do not need to believe in the magic," Haldor replied, his voice carrying a peace that had been absent for 3 long years. "Perhaps they need only to see that 2 people who had every reason to hate each other chose instead to heal the wounds between them." The village spread before them in the afternoon light, and already they could see that something had changed in their absence. The docks bustled with activity, but the workers moved with a different energy, less driven by desperate necessity and more motivated by shared purpose. Children played in the streets with laughter that carried further than it had before, and the smoke rising from the cooking fires seemed somehow cleaner, as if even the air itself had been purified by the breaking of the ancient curse. Bjorn Ironside was the first to spot them, his weathered face breaking into a grin of relief and wonder. "By Thor's hammer," he called out, rushing to embrace his oldest friend, "we feared you were lost forever. But look at you, you carry yourself like a man who has found something precious." "I have found my son," Haldor said simply, and though Eric was not with them in body, everyone who heard those words understood that he spoke a truth deeper than mere physical presence. "More than that, I have found what it means to be the father he deserved all along." The crowd that gathered around them grew larger as words spread of their return. But instead of the fearful whispers that had once followed Astrid through the village, there were nods of respect and gratitude. Somehow, in their absence, the people of Ravenshollow had begun to remember why they had once welcomed her gifts. "Your healing touch was sorely missed," said Ingrid Stormcrow, the eldest of the village women. "Young Olaf broke his arm in a fall, and though we tended it as best we could, it healed crooked. We realized how much we had taken your skill for granted." Astrid smiled, her heart lighter than it had been in years. "I will tend to Olaf's arm," she said, "and to any other hurts that need healing. But I will also teach others what I know, so that healing becomes a gift shared by the whole community rather than the burden of one person alone." Over the following days, the transformation in both returned travelers became evident to all who knew them. Haldor, once driven by the need to prove his strength through dominance over others, now demonstrated a different kind of power, the strength to listen, to admit when he was wrong, to find solutions that honored both justice and mercy. He began training the village's young people not just in the arts of war, but in the wisdom of knowing when not to fight. True strength, he would tell them, his voice carrying the authority of hard-won experience, lies not in the ability to destroy your enemies, but in the capacity to transform them into friends. Astrid established a healing practice that became the heart of the village's spiritual life. Her cottage, once isolated on the outskirts of Ravenshollow, became a gathering place where people came not just for physical healing, but for guidance in mending the emotional wounds that poisoned communities from within. She taught them to listen to the whispers of the spirit world, to honor their ancestors without being enslaved by their mistakes. The memory stone found its permanent home in the center of the village, placed on a pedestal where all could see and touch it. Children would gather around it in the evenings to hear the stories it contained, not just the tale of Haldor and Astrid's journey, but the deeper truths about the power of forgiveness to transform even the most bitter hatred into wisdom. As the seasons turned and winter gave way to spring, the effects of the healing rippled outward from Ravenshollow to touch neighboring communities. Traders carried stories of the village where former enemies had learned to work together, where children grew up understanding that strength came in many forms, where the wisdom of the gentle heart was valued as highly as the courage of the warrior's spirit. The forest that had once been called the Darkwood became known as the Grove of Second Chances, a place where pilgrims came to seek healing for their own ancient wounds. The great tree at its heart grew green again, its branches reaching toward a sky that seemed somehow brighter than before. On quiet evenings, when the village had settled into peaceful rest, Haldor would walk to the shore, where he had once stood vigil for his lost son. But now, he came not to mourn what had been taken from him, but to celebrate what had been given, the knowledge that love could indeed be stronger than death, that healing was always possible for those brave enough to choose it. And sometimes, when the wind was just right and the moon cast silver paths across the water, he could swear he heard Eric's voice carried on the evening breeze, not calling for rescue, but singing songs of joy for a world where ancient hatreds had finally learned to transform themselves into love. The cycle of healing continued, spreading outward like ripples on still water, touching lives that would never know the names of those who had chosen forgiveness over revenge in a cursed forest on the longest night of the year.